Blessings, everyone. Thank you for joining me. And this is part of a series of podcasts I'm doing on my favorite films, motion pictures, movies. Today, it's going to be The Lost City of Z and Ad Astra from 2016 and 2019, both directed by James Gray. I love both of these movies. The Lost City of Z is a great film. I think Ad Astra is probably one of the greatest films ever made, in my opinion. And I'm titling this podcast "The Wonderful Horrible Fathers of the Lost City of Z and Ad Astra," and we'll get into it. And let's take a deep dive into those two movies. I said James Gray directed both of these movies. Thankfully, I got to see both of them during their original release on the big screen because these are beautiful films to look at in terms of cinematography and music. So I think they're worth watching at home on television. I've watched them several times, but I'm glad I got to see them. Hopefully, maybe they'll be re-released again on the big screen. A little bit about James Gray. He was born in 1969. He's of Russian Jewish ancestry. His one of his first films was called Two Lovers. It was based on a Dostoevsky story called White Knights, and he's very much delves into the male mind. James Gray. He's a men's director, which is sort of not something you hear about. You hear a lot about women's films and women directors nowadays. There isn't a real keen observation of men anymore into the male psyche, but James Gray does that over and over again in his movies. I'm appreciative. Kind of reminded me of Gone with the Wind, which was originally directed by George Cukor, who was very much considered a woman's director at that time, and Clark Gable wasn't really thrilled with him, and so he was replaced. So there were, even back in the heyday of Hollywood in the classic film era, people like George Cukor, Vincent Minnelli were considered, very good at women directing women or in women's pictures. And I think James Gray is a premier artist nowadays that's looking very deeply into the male psyche and not dismissing it as something toxic or uh, not worthy of exploration. He's really a great artist. Some of his favorite films are 2001: A Space Odyssey, which I love. The Leopard, which is a really interesting movie. I like Alan DeLeon. He's in it. Um, Alain DeLeon, the French actor, and that's very much a male-centered um, movie. And another movie that he said he liked is called Ordette. It's a Danish film, which it's sort of a bizarre movie. But it has a very strong male cast, and the father is very much a central sort of character in that movie, and the son and his sons. It's about a father and his son, so I can see why James Gray really liked it. In 2013, he released probably one of his first like major films. It was called The Immigrant, and it was uh, uh, starring Joaquin Phoenix, who it's interesting that James Gray is drawn to actors like that who I think are very strong male personalities, somebody like Brad Pitt, too, that we'll see in Ad Astra. Um, so his next film, I thought this was fascinating. He's working on a JFK biopic, an early titled called Mayday, and it's about the quote, the turbulent relationship he had with his father. Wow. So James Gray sticking to this theme of a father and son. I can't wait till this movie comes out. In 2020, he released a movie called Armageddon Time. I did not see it in the theater. I actually wasn't even that aware of it. I wonder if during COVID it got a wide release, but it was an autobiographical film based on his own family, especially his father, and it describes certain abuse which he experienced as a child. I was reading about the film. I found some interesting quotes about um, the dad as portrayed in the movie, which is really James Gray's dad, I suppose. And it says, the father is revealed as someone who beats his children. Quote, he was worse in real life, reflects Gray. But if I showed what he did, you would hate him, so I had to soften it a little. But my job is to show you what I was like and what my family was like, warts and all. Wow. And then this is, by the way, from a Screen Daily interview in 2022. And then he said, quote, here was a person who was struggling to put food on the table, that I think parenting was not the first, second, or even third order of the day. Violence was more normal, if you want to call it that, in the 70s. He probably suffered at the hands of his dad. I also think it's an act of incompetence. So James Gray has his own, history with his own father in his childhood. So I can see why he's attracted to these themes of father and son and these films and these stories. Because when I first saw The Lost City of Z, I loved it. And then I heard that Ad Astra was coming out, and I heard sort of what the story was about. I had no idea it was directed by James Gray, and I went and saw it, and I thought, well, those two movies had similar themes. And then I dug into it deeper, and I went, wow, that was the director of Lost City of Z. And James Gray also wrote the screenplay for these films too. So he's very talented. Um, there's also a sort of, I would say, a sort of melancholy about these movies that, they don't have to, sometimes people want a happy ending. They want to leave the theater feeling upbeat. I think in The Lost City of Z, that wasn't the case. It was definitely more so at Ad Astra, but it was a long journey. And he said this in a GQ interview from 2022. James Gray, sad is not the same thing as depressing. And so sad to me is an aspect of our emotional life, which is quite beautiful. It's who we are. Life is sad in many ways. That's part of why beauty exists. Beauty is connected to sadness. Beauty doesn't exist in the infinite. Beauty is connected to death. Beauty is connected to finality. I thought that was really interesting. And so his movies are complex. They're not cookie cutter. I can't even say they're Hollywood. They have like an independent sort of filmmaking aspect to them. They're very cool. I love them. I can't talk enough about them. About from that same GQ interview about Ad Astra, before we even get into the movie, since we're just talking about James Gray, I wanted to give you another quote. He said about the movie, he said, is about my relationship with my father, who is beginning to lose touch, and his dreams of grandeur. Hmm, interesting. Here is James Gray with the star of the film, Charlie Hunnam, a British actor, very, very good actor. The cast that James Gray puts together for these films is very old school because they're like all great actors. And even in supporting, there's a lot of supporting parts. And sometimes I think nowadays in films, people don't want to be a supporting player. They want to be a star. So you had Sienna Miller, who's another great actor, English actress. I don't think she's ever gotten the credit she deserves. Underrated. Um, and Tom Holland, who was very good. Everybody was really good in this movie, even though they weren't big, maybe showy parts, character parts. They were just great. The Lost City of Z is based upon a real person, Percy Fawcett, who was an English explorer. His dates were 1867 to 1925. You know, I did some reading about him, and he, he essentially abandoned his wife and children to, I mean, that's part and parcel of being an explorer, to look for this lost city of Z in South America. And that's what the film portrays. Here's Sienna Miller and Percy Fawcett's young son. In the beginning of the film, there's this interesting stag hunt, and Percy Fawcett is in the military, and but right away we find out that there's something wrong. Although he wins this hunt, he kills the stag. There's talk about him. He's unfortunate in his choice of ancestors, and there's a conversation later that his father was a drunkard and had brought some sort of shame upon the family. So part of Percy's motivation is to bring back the family name. And we talked about this earlier. It's a theme in a lot of Westerns. It was a theme in a movie that I liked, The Eagle, which I talked about, starring Channing Tatum. It was also a big theme in the Star Trek universe with one of my favorite characters, Worf, the Klingon, who his entire arc, his character arc is redeeming his family name after there's been some sort of shame brought about through his father, even though with his father it wasn't true. But that's a theme in a lot of these father-son dynamics, and it's in this one. And Percy Fawcett is interested in uh, uh, bringing back honor to his family and his family name. So he's offered an expedition to South America to not so much as an explorer, but as a surveyor. But it's a prestigious assignment and dangerous though, and it's going to take him away from his wife and son for many years. He finds out that his wife is pregnant, but he takes it and leaves. Robert Pattinson is the other guy. He was very good in this movie too. I didn't know much about him. He was really good. Their first expedition to South America is very cool. There's a lot of this movie that reminded me of Apocalypse Now, Francis Ford Coppola's famous film. And there's also aspects of Ad Astra that reminded me of Apocalypse Now. I'm going to talk about that later. They go to this, they happen upon this rubber plantation in the depths of the jungle, and it's run by this baron, and it's Franco Nero is the actor, and I love Franco Nero. He's a great movie star from the 60s, Italian, did westerns, and it was just very good. Um, awesome. It kind of reminded me of Colonel Kurtz from Apocalypse Now, who set up this whole sort of city in the jungle and this whole civilization, and they happen upon this at night where they're playing opera, and it's quite bizarre, but it's very cool. It also reminded me of Joseph Conrad's novel The Heart of Darkness, which is what Francis Ford Coppola based Apocalypse Now on. And Heart of Darkness is it's sort of a metaphor for the explorer going deeper and deeper into the jungle and deeper into the darkness of his subconscious. And things get weirder and weirder. It's very cool. So these early scenes are very evocative. They're very beautiful. They're very wonderfully filmed, acted. Can't say enough about it. And eventually, Percy Fawcett from this adventure returns home, and his son, upon meeting him, his son Jack says, "Are you my father?" Very heartbreaking. He hasn't seen him, and his wife is given birth to another child, a boy. So it's sort of beyond his own convictions um, to renew his family name. Percy Fawcett comes back a hero, and he's swept up in the fame and notoriety of his new role as famous surveyor slash explorer. But Percy Fawcett leaves yet again, goes back to the Amazon, this time not as a surveyor, but looking for this lost city of Z, which I should talk a little bit about. Percy Fawcett was a Theophysist, Theophist, I don't know how to pronounce it, Theophysist. It was a certain sort of religious sect or cult or set. It wasn't really a cult. It was like a set of beliefs that was popular, especially in the Victorian period, late 19th, early 20th century. Madame Blavatsky, who wrote the Secret Doctrine, was somebody very involved in that movement. When I was involved in the occult, I had heard of Madame Blavatsky and the Secret Doctrine. I even read it. It was a pretty long tome, kind of crazy. Well, Percy Fawcett, especially his brother, was very involved with Blavatsky. Yeah, his brother Edward knew Blavatsky was involved in the writing of the Secret Doctrine. Um, Part of it had to do with this. It was sort of a lost history of the human race. There were these Lumerians who were people who inhabited the earth. They had psychic powers and all of this stuff. So they believe people that believe in this, devotees of this, believe that there was some sort of archaeological evidence of the Lumerians and of the humankind's past. Atlantis was one of them. Maybe this lost city of Z had something to do with that lost city, or the Secret Doctrine, or the Lumerians, or this lost race that inhabited the Earth. So he goes back a second time, not as a surveyor, but as somebody looking for this lost city that he thought he saw evidence of during his first ex, during his first expedition. Um, so he goes back looking for the lost city of Z, gets funded, and he takes other people with him. They really come back with little to no evidence for their efforts. One of the things that I think was a little bit odd about the movie, Percy Fawcett is kind of portrayed as almost sort of a like civil rights leader for the indigenous native peoples in the Amazon, because the English are portrayed, back in the UK, as having a difficult time believing that, so-called primitive people could construct this incredible city, which is sort of weird because the Aztecs, you know, Tenochtitlan, the famous city where Mexico City is. I mean, they constructed that, and the Maya, Chichen Itza, and the Inca at Machu Picchu. So, the people of the Americas were certainly advanced, in terms of that. So, and he's sort of portrayed as being very pro the indigenous people, which perhaps he was. I don't remember reading that. But you got to look back at the Secret Doctrine, and he was of that belief that if this lost city of Z existed, it had something to do with Atlantis and the Lumerians and the Secret Doctrines. Well, when he comes back from that second expedition, World War II, or excuse me, World War One has begun, or is just about to begin, and he goes to the war, and there's some interesting scenes. Probably the most interesting part of that uh, section of the movie is that there's this sort of Russian mystic woman who's at the front line somehow they the soldiers have brought her in to read palms and tell people's future, and it's like very much sort of a Madame Blavatsky sort of character. So I thought that was kind of cool. Jack has grown up by this point, his eldest son, and there's another boy and there's another girl, and there's a girl in the family at this point, and Jack is hostile towards his father for essentially not being there, for either being in South America or at this point being at the war. So this isn't this is this is a dynamic that you see in a section of the population that I've been interested in, and that's the LGBT, especially gay men, have often very hostile, angry relationships with their father. And as you see in the movie, quite close relationships with their mothers. And that's very much the case between Jack and his mother, who he's been left with. He's sort of a surrogate father, husband, while his father is off, and the son is angry. I wanted to show this article that I wrote quite a while ago. Let me see, when did I write this? Back in 2016. Well, okay, it's called "Mommy Dearest: Gay Men and Their Mothers." I'll just read this first part. I encourage you to look it up. Scientist Simon LeVay, who has spent most of his career trying to locate a gay genetic determinant for homosexuality in his book Gay Straight and the Reason Why, The Science of Sexual Orientation, wrote, "Gay men do indeed describe their relationships with their mothers as closer, and their relationships with their fathers as more distant and hostile as compared with how straight men describe these relationships." Borrowing from the theories of American psychiatrist and gay activist Richard Issei, LeVay thinks it's possible that some pre-homosexual boys exhibit certain traits which fathers dislike but mothers like. As a consequence, some mothers, quote, become unusually protective of a son whom they see being exposed to teasing or hostility from the father or from other children. And then I just talk about that. And then I put a lot of quotes in here, especially from people in the entertainment field, who are gay, self-professed gay, talking about their relationships with their fathers and their mothers. So that's worth looking at. But back to the movie, I think the best scenes in the movie are actually between Percy Fawcett and his wife, played by Sienna Miller, and then sometimes with their son Jack. They're not a lot, but they're great. They're well acted, and I think it brings out the anger and the frustration that this boy rightly feels towards his father, who has essentially abandoned them. And Jack brings us up about his father's obligation to his family, and he talks about how his father had abandoned them and abandoned him and abandoned his mother, and there's some great scenes in there. But then there's this beautiful scene when Percy Fawcett comes back from the war and he's been badly injured, and there's a reconciliation between father and son at that point, because what child doesn't want to love their parent, and what son doesn't want to love and respect his father? And it's a touching scene, but I think it's tinged with tragedy because we know what the rest of the movie is like. So the film sort of fast forwards at this point, and it's years later. Jack is older, and Percy Fawcett and his wife is sort of have a comfortable existence. And but there's still a lot of interest in his exploration and his early expeditions. And his son gets the idea to go back to South America with his father. This whole film for me, especially the end, is like a metaphor for that lost boy grasping towards his dad, who either neglected him or abandoned him or didn't love him or abused him or whatever. And that boy is desperately trying to have a relationship with his dad. And you see that in the movie. Um, there's a very interesting conversation, very short, with Robert Pattinson um, and Percy Fawcett. He's talking to this is one of his former colleagues on the expedition, and he asks him about going back to South America, and he says, I have a wife and child now," and he just says, "I can go," and that is a rational answer. I have a wife and child. I can't go. When he went with him on these expeditions, on these adventures, he was a single guy. And this kind of gets to the point of, and this gets into Ad Astra too, expedition journey, taking these life-threatening adventures. Who does that? Should a married man with kids do that? Or if you want to live that kind of adventurous life, should you be single with no attachments? So it's sort of an interesting question. I would probably argue that a father with children probably shouldn't be going on these sort of things, climbing Mount Everest, although it's much safer to do now than it was, say, during George Mallory's days in the 1920s when he never returned. Or let's say going into space, let's say taking a trip to Mars, which nobody has done. Is that a good idea for a, a married man with kids to leave his uh, wife and children at home on Earth and leave for years? I would say no, it isn't. It's something that a single guy should certainly do if he's qualified and wants to do it. So they leave on this journey. This gets me to I think this is another theme. I think for the film too is the reality or the idea of obsession, especially male obsession. You don't see it so much in females do not become obsessive like men. That's why men have much higher rates of mental illness and suicide than women. And you also don't have great this might be politically incorrect, but who cares? You don't have a lot of female geniuses like a Michelangelo or a Dostoevsky. You don't have female versions of them. You don't have a female version of Michelangelo or Dostoevsky. J.K. Rowling, people would say, but I mean, I don't think Harry Potter is on the same literary uh, scale as the Brothers Karamazov. So you don't have that level of obsession, and that's why men do these sort of seemingly crazy things. Because when you watch these guys in the lost city of Z trudging across the Amazon, they're like, "Why am I doing this?" They say this. Why? He says it a couple of times. Percy Fawcett. Why am I here in this misery? What I could be with my family, and his motives are complex. With like I talked about, trying to bring back honor to his family, but it's sort of that obsessive quality that men have that women don't have. So father and son are back in the Amazon, and they're captured rather quickly and by hostile indigenous people. It's all tragic. The whole thing, sort of the wonder that is in the film during that first expedition is gone by the time you get to this third one with his son. It feels very desperate and sad and tragic. That aspect, I think, is distilled in this image. This is probably my favorite picture from the movie. It's towards the end when Percy and his son leave home, and the son is in the back of this truck, um, and the cold. His dad is, very much the hero, waving, and they're off on this misguided, self-destructive adventure. He's dragging his poor son along with him, and his son, who grew up neglected, I would say abused by his father, he wasn't there, goes along with him in sort of this desperate attempt to bond with his dad, and it ends in their death. The real Percy Fawcett and his son were never found, and the end of the movie is very poignant with Sienna Miller playing the mother, still never giving up hope for them. When I watched Lost City of Z um, again recently, I noticed that the executive producer, lo and behold, is Brad Pitt. And he is the star of our next James Gray movie, Ad Astra. And you could tell, as much as I love the Lost City of Z, I love Ad Astra even more. If that's possible. It's a great film. I think it's one of the greatest films ever made. I think it should have got better. The Academy Awards is a joke, but when I saw the movie in the theater, I go, "Well, Brad Pitt is going to win Best Actor. This is an incredible performance." And for this movie, he was not even nominated. Little bit about Brad Pitt too. I think he's an underrated actor. Um, Very good. I just don't think there's parts worthy for very good actors nowadays. But this was certainly one of them, and I could see because Brad Pitt works with James Gray in terms of producing these films, so I could see why he puts his money that he's worked hard to make into these movies because they're great films and they're great roles for him and they're great roles for other actors. So here is James Gray and Brad Pitt working on this film. It's very similar to Lost City of Z. It's not like those biblical epics, which I started out with The Robe, doing these podcasts on movies. It's not a cast of thousands. It's a cast of like 20. They're very small casts, but great parts, and it really zeroes in on people. So they're sort of grand movies. Like Lost City of Z has big scope, great cinematography, and Ad Astra's the same way. It's got great special effects. So you've got this sort of broadness about the movie, this sort of cinemascope style of filmmaking that's kind of 1950s, which I love. But it also has this very intimate sort of close up character of it, where it focuses in on the actors and the parts and their character. If I had to describe Ad Astra, it's a movie about isolation. It's a movie about a son and his father. The themes are very similar to Lost City of Z. It starts out Brad Pitt Brad Pitt plays Roy McBride. You should call him an astronaut. He's in he's in the military. It's in the future, and his father is this heroic Clifford McBride, kind of like a Neil Armstrong kind of guy. The first, not the first on the moon, but he was the first to Jupiter, the first to Saturn. He was a major heroic figure, and he went on an expedition, not unlike Percy Fawcett to the Amazon. He went on an expedition to the outer solar system to Neptune and disappeared. Sounds familiar. Leaving Roy as a boy with his mother. And the two films are bookends. They both have these sort of flashback scenes of Roy with his dad. It reminds me a lot about The Eagle with Channing Tatum, and his father disappeared in Scotland. And there's these flashback scenes of memories of his father leaving as a child and never seeing him again. So Roy, it's an interesting part for Liv Tyler too. I don't think she has any actual lines in the movie, but she plays his estranged wife. And again, it's like these actors are willing to take these small parts, but they're great and they do great things with them. Just like Sienna Miller in The Lost City of Z wasn't a big part, but she did great things with it. He's very closed off emotionally, and he a part and parcel of his military careers is they got to take these constant psych evaluations. It reminds me in those scenes in THX 1138, the George Lucas movie, with Robert Duvall, where they step into these little sort of confessional cubicles and they have to like confess things, and then this computer sort of spits out some sort of advice or whatever, medication. But he's constantly got to do these psych evaluations where they're monitoring his heartbeat and all these things. And if he's too emotional, too excited, he's got too much adrenaline running through his body, you can't do this or you can't do that. And because he's doing dangerous work. In the beginning of the film, he's up on this space antenna and he falls. And, most people would freak out or die of fright or have a stroke. And he stays very calm and cool. He's very cut off emotionally, probably because of the deep, well, not probably, because of the deep trauma that he endured and experienced as a boy with the abandonment of his father and then the loss. And it's not explored, but it's mentioned very briefly that his mother was devastated and it psychologically and like physically killed her, that the father had left and disappeared. And he describes he has a sort of self-destructive side to himself that his wife picked up on and why she probably, left. And they have no children. And he there's an interesting quote from the movie because it's in contrast to what was in The Lost City of Z. He goes, "It's a dangerous business, best not to subject others to it," in terms of his work in space. So he finds out that his father, who's been missing, hasn't seen him for 30 years, um, is possibly still alive. So Roy was 16 when his father left, and he was 29 years old when he disappeared. And he's been living under the shadow of this great but possibly flawed man. This reminds me of the eagle, too, about the son living in the shadow of a great man. It goes back to Hamlet and the difficulty that a son has living under that sort of veil of of sort of missed fatherhood or misplaced fatherhood. It's interesting because Donald Sutherland, who was in The Eagle, which was a movie that previously reviewed, he's got a small part in this as well. And it's kind of the same sort of character. He's sort of a father figure or a stand-in father for Channing Tatum in The Eagle and also for Brad Pitt in this movie. He knew uh, Brad Pitt's Roy, the character Brad Pitt plays. He knows the father. He knew his father, and he's there to sort of guide him at this time because they feel that Roy's father is alive and that he's possibly sending this is the details of the film, sending sort of these gamma rays or these uh, uh, radiation rays to Earth that's gonna destroy it. So they're trying to contact him. So Donald Sutherland's character is a paternal, compassionate man who's reaching out towards Roy. I mentioned that there's part of Ad Astra that reminds me of Apocalypse Now, and it's the scenes where Roy is sort of going through his father's files or sort of reviewing his life and what a heroic sort of mythic character he is. And it does remind me of Colonel Kurtz from Apocalypse Now, because there's a scene where Martin Sheen is looking through the files and thinking, this is was such a great, heroic, mythic character, and then there's sort of this twit turn where what's happened to him has something gone wrong. And with Kurtz, that was the case in Apocalypse Now. He'd sort of gone rogue out in the jungle and was training these, guerrilla fighters. And there's sort of this question in Ad Astra early on about what's happened to Roy's father, Clifford McBride. What has he gone rogue or has he gone crazy? You know, there's some great lines, and I've written a few of them down when Roy's trying to understand his father, and he says, "I understand that rage. I saw it in my father and me." And then he talks about how his father left him and he has to leave for the moon. He has to leave Earth, go to the moon, so he can vis-a-vis head to Mars to try to contact his father. And there's this really poignant line, very strong line. He goes, "I will deal with my father." So this is a son different from Jack in the Lost City of Z, who's quite desperate and quite needy. But he's young. He's a young, inexperienced boy. This is a man. And although he's been traumatized and damaged and very hurt by his father, there's still a strength there that you don't see in Jack from the Lost City of Z. And it's just because of age and experience. Here's Liv Tyler as his wife. She's quite great in the movie. She's a very good actress. Here are those scenes that I was talking about that reminded me of Apocalypse Now, where he's sort of going through his dad's files and really trying to understand what happened as best he can to his dad, what happened to him and his family. So Roy makes it to Mars to contact his dad, who's supposedly in orbit around Neptune on the other side of the solar system. And he's got to keep his emotions in check. He's got these constant psych evaluations. Interesting quote from the movie. "I must accept the fact that I never really knew you," speaking about his father, "or am I you being pulled down the same dark hole?" Again, this reminds me of Joseph Conrad's The Heart of Darkness, where sort of the journey or the expedition is sort of this pulling down into the sort of the psyche, but into a very dark part of it, where either you heal and you sort of realize how dark it is, or you just keep going down. You just keep it's sort of like you look into the darkness and then the darkness looks back at you, where you can't escape it at that point. And he's really struggling. There's another interesting line from the movie. The son suffers for the sins of the father. That was really interesting. I mean, it's got religious, biblical connotations, all kinds of, powerful imagery there. And in a way, um, that is true in terms of the effects of trauma and abuse and neglect. I mean, on this podcast and on my website and my blog, I've explored ad nauseum how boys that are raised in that sort of environment of paternal neglect and abuse have really serious problems as adults, with mental illness, drug abuse, and then a small minority with homosexuality, which is about 4% of the population. So, although, like I read earlier, the majority of gay men report having bad or non-existent relationships with their fathers, I always hear from straight men who say, "Hey, I had a bad relationship with my father. I didn't turn out gay." Well, and neither did, Roy in this movie. Uh, well, yeah, that's most do not. Most have it exhibits in other ways. Like in this movie, he's emotionally cut off. His wife leaves him because she can't deal with it anymore because he's not vulnerable, he's not available to her emotionally. So that's how the majority of men cope or with having bad fathers. Only 4% of men are gay, so most of them will end up like Roy McBride in this movie with bad marriages, emotionally unavailable, uh, um, alone, getting involved with possibly drugs, alcohol, pornography, other bad relationships. So, the human mind is unique and people uh, react in different ways, but there's commonalities there. But like I talked about earlier, in order to keep working in this sort of uh, space, team, whatever, I forget what it was called in the film. It's not NASA, it's something else. Um, he's got to keep his emotions in check because he's got to have these constant psych evaluations. Well, all of these memories of his father finally coming out, he's practically in middle age, and they're finally coming out because he's got to deal with it, with his dad possibly being alive, his wife leaving him, and he fails his psych evaluation. But he figures out a way to stow away, or well, it's complicated. And you watch the film. These reviews are full of spoilers. But he figures out a way to get onto this ship that's heading towards Neptune and Clifford McBride. And there's another really fascinating line. This one's from Donald Sutherland's character, and he said, "A voyage of exploration can be used for something as simple as escape." And that really had me thinking about this, how men escape. I mean, they're not going into space nowadays, but men escape through sort of mundane, banal, routine ways, like in sports, getting way too involved, fantasy football, and all this stuff. Pornography is another one. Video games, which are often have these role playing aspects where people get deeply into them. And that's sort of an escape as well. Something that I've been interested in is mountain climbing. Um, I mean, I'm sort of a very amateur mountain climber. I haven't scaled any major, mountains. Um, but I, but in California, we have some tall ones over 10,000 feet. Um, it is a sort of escape from reality, and before men, ventured into space, that was sort of the astronauts of an earlier era, men who climbed Mount Everest or K2, or Mount McKinley. And somebody who I was interested in was Jack London, who's a local San Francisco guy. And he did a lot of these sort of adventures when this was like going into space. He went to the Klondike and the Yukon. He went to the Far East. He went to Polynesia, and it was for him growing up very poor, abandoned by his father. It was sort of an escape into an adventure and to write about it. And somebody who wrote his book, who I admire, Walter Bonatti, was a very famous Italian mountain climber, climbed K2 and a lot of other mountains. And grew up poor in Italy. And it's sort of an aspect of mountain climbing, I think, is escape. I found an interesting quote from Reinhold Messner, who's probably one of the greatest, alpine mountain climbers of all time. He wrote, "In the beginning, climbing was a kind of escape from reality into my world of stone, but later climbing became my passion and gave me the resilience I need to survive in the world." I thought that was interesting. So, I mean, these sort of escapes can start out, or these adventures, I should say, or these expeditions can start out as sort of escape, but they need to build upon that, and to improve sort of your life in the real world. Um, in terms of like movies, I've always been interested in Westerns. I'm kind of like obsessed with Westerns, Western TV shows, Western movies. I wrote it's in my book, I wrote a section kind of on the Westerns, especially Shane and some of the TV Westerns from the 1950s, and like Cheyenne and Bronco, and those are the Warner Brothers Westerns, Colt 45, and that I really liked. And part of the character sort of development in those Westerns and in the movies as well was that a lot of them took place after the Civil War. So like post 1865, after that period. And a lot of the guys that ventured westward, single guys who were veterans of the war, had been shell shocked, blown up, survived physically, but sometimes not that well mentally, ventured west into this great adventure and expedition and journey. And it was sort of an escape for them to leave that world that had been like so shattered and had been so violent, and so I've always found that very, very, very interesting, where men have sort of gravitated towards that. um I think, and more sort of pre-industrial, although America was in a post-industrial society, but not technological like we are today, where sort of that escape from trauma maybe had more healthy aspects, like to venture west, where in this very sort of highly uh, technical and technology driven culture that we're in today, that escape like immediately swerves into something destructive, uh, like pornography or drugs or gambling, whatever it is. So Roy finds his father. His father has gone kind of mad. Yeah. And they have a lot of conversations that are very interesting. And his father, I think, very much like Percy Fawcett in The Lost City of Z, was just a heroic character, but a bad dad. Bad. Um, Not there physically or emotionally, for their son. And unlike Jack in The Lost City of Z, and I think this is again just because of age, the age of the character and the experience, Roy's able to let go of his father. And he literally lets go. I won't, watch the film, but he literally lets go of him. And that's the end. And he can move on and find forgiveness in in death, in the death of his father, and just sort of there's a resolution in that. So the ending of Ad Astra is ends on a much more hopeful note of healing than the Lost City of Z, which the Lost City of Z is very much tragedy and despair, at the death of the father and the son. And in Ad Astra, the son survives, the son lives, and is really able to become whole again and to be healed and to go back to Earth and to hopefully, I mean, we don't know, but hopefully mend things with his wife who reappears. And now with that trauma and abuse and wound that he experienced with his father healed, or at least very much on the road to being healed, he can have a relationship with someone, with his wife, and he can be healthy. A couple of my favorite lines from the movie are these from Roy McBride, Brad Pitt. I've talked when I should have listened. I was harsh when I should have been tender. And then he talks about his father being broken, and he said, quote, or was he always broken? I mean, it's difficult when you grow up with a father who's broken to know when to be tender. You know, to give him a break. And it's not blaming bad dads, as I called them, because, like in the case of Percy Fawcett, I mean, we don't know much about Clifford McBride's dad. We don't know anything, but Percy Fawcett's dad was himself not a good father. I mean, we don't know much about him, but we know he was an alcoholic. You know, so you're already these men who are fathers and turn out to be, bad dads are coming at it as at a loss as well. So Roy McBride is introspective enough to realize that he's, messed up. He's not a father at this point yet, but in terms of with his wife, he's made a lot of mistakes and failed. So those are a couple of my favorite lines from the movie. Well, thanks for spending so much time with me on these two movies. I really do love them. I could talk about them for much, much longer. Uh, I think they're appropriate for um, a family to watch. Certainly not young children, because I think there's issues of drama and violence and intense situations in them. I don't think there's anything immoral in these movies that I noticed. Um, but I think they're great for maybe a father and a little bit of an older son, teen son to watch. I think they're great. I love them. So thank you for joining me, and I'll be watching more films that delve into the father-son relationship, and we'll explore them together later. God bless you.